Welcome everybody to today's panel, where we're going to be talking about some of the economic, societal and governance issues related to the development, design and deployment of ICN. As Ken just mentioned, hopefully we can have a rather interactive discussion going on through Slack. If you look at the bottom of the PowerPoint, next to this actually surprisingly animated Slack GIF, which I didn't realize was animated, there is the channel title, Session 6 panel. So throughout the whole duration of the hour, if you have any questions or you'd like to interrupt with something, feel free to dump in there and I'll keep an eye on what's going on. So just to give a little bit of background here for the motivation behind why we thought this panel might be interesting to everybody. We know for many years now that networking technologies have been developed time and time again, but in many cases have not been deployed. And the reason they've not been deployed is often nothing to do with the technical design of the work, but instead to do with contextual factors in terms of how those systems are incentivized, how they're regulated, how the economics drive companies to deploy them or not. So borrowing the words of Robert Kiyosaki, if you want to go somewhere, it's best to try and talk to somebody who's tried to go there before to understand why. And luckily today we've got a panel consisting of members that for many years now have been participating in both network design and governance and economic factors. So what our goal is today is to try and explore some of those non-technical challenges and barriers that will impede the development and the deployment of ICN. So we're very lucky in that we've got 4 great speakers today. Some of you, I assume, will already know them. So first of all, we've got Professor Dirk Kutscher, who's a professor at Emden University, one of the main drivers of ICN, particularly as part of his role as the chair in the ICN RG, which many of you will participate in. Some people may not know the second speaker, Emanuele. Emanuele is an economics professor at Anglia Ruskin University and a fellow at Hughes Hall, University of Cambridge. And Emanuele has done a huge body of work looking at economics factors in networks design, particularly understanding competition between networks and the incentives that drive them to interconnect. Our third speaker, again, many of you will already know, Eve, is a principal engineer and director of emerging tech at Intel. And again, she's been one of the major driving forces behind the ICN work that we've seen in recent years. And last but not least, we have Ignacio Castro, who's actually an assistant prof at my own university, Queen Mary University of London. And he again is an economist by background, but he's done a lot of work looking at internet and network economics. So hopefully this will be a set of rather diverse opinions. And again, I encourage everybody on the call to jump in with questions and interrupt when they think they've got something valuable to contribute. So the way we're going to run today's panel is each panelist is going to have a 5-minute pitch. They promised to stick to 5 minutes. So hopefully that will be adhered to. Everybody's going to kick off with a 5-minute pitch, and then we're going to move into a Q&A session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dirk, who's our first speaker of the session.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'm really glad to be on this panel. Thanks for inviting me. So sometimes in our community, so we are a bit technology happy or optimistic. So we think that say our favorite technology will solve all possible issues. And so in the internet, okay, there are admittedly quite a few things that we could, you know, classify as real problems of societal relevance. All the surveillance problems, disinformation, censorship, and so on. If you look at this closely, I mean, you have to admit that these are actually not new problems. So that they have been around all the time, also before the internet, but still right now, some of these are really pressing issues depending on where you stand. But the bad news is that, I mean, replacing TCP/IP or QUIC with ICN will not do anything to solve these issues, right? So we have to admit that, well, for example, surveillance, there is an interplay of several functions at different layers. So quite often it's application layer, things, cookies and fingerprinting and so on. So whatever we do in terms of coming up with a, say, better underlay, you can be sure that if we don't, you know, reconstruct the economic incentives, there will be sufficient push to maybe achieve similar things as are being done today in the internet. And then there are, features that we may not like legal interception and so on, that are actually based on policies, societal needs, and so on. So any new technology probably also has to implement them in some way, and this often also opens the door for other problems. So people who are much smarter have also thought about this problem. So the problem how to design a future network years ago. And so the notion was that, well, you have to accept the fact that there are multiple stakeholders with adverse interest in the system. And so you have to accommodate that for designing a new system. Well, today, I mean, it's not like, so basically you can say that there are evil players and bad players. So what basically my censorship may actually be a protection against disinformation. So every country is seeing that from their own perspective. Personally, I may not like censorship, but while I want to control what's going on in my company and my home network, what my kids are able to do, and so on. So these are also different perspectives. And so the best we can do, in my opinion, is, we have to acknowledge, well, the tussles, the different perspectives, but I think there is an opportunity to, design a more transparent feature or policy implementation with maybe less collateral damage compared to what we are seeing today. And just want to give you one example that we also already talked about at this conference, DNS. So DNS, originally designed as a naming system, distributed implementation, is used for many, many things today. So the name to address resolution, of course, but also namespace for web PKI, traffic steering for CDN. Bruce talked about that. Very often it's used as a control point for content access. Well, it's used for surveillance, but also for maybe directing requests to somewhere else, so manipulation. And looking at the tussles and the problems that occur in the DNS and web space today. So just simple example, for example, CDN operators, they want to steer their traffic. We have seen that yesterday. And what they typically need is a good mapping of users to edge servers. So for that purpose, DNS got extended with EDNS Open Zero. The surveillance industry wants to generate web interaction, fingerprint us, track us across different sites, and so on. I am as a user, I may want to be interested in I may be interested in getting like my Netflix content or whatever efficiently and reliably. If I try to, for example, defend myself against surveillance, maybe I'm using personal firewalls or DNS filters and so on. Now this interferes with some other services. We have things like encrypted DNS, so DNS over HTTPS, for example, some dominant, service providers and browser providers do this. And then we still have like operating systems that also want to, do something useful in that space. And so there are many conflicts, and so many things don't really interoperate very nicely. You can see that, so there's an ITF activity it's called application behavior considering DNS, where so people now try to specify what applications that want to resolve DNS names themselves need to consider in this universe where there could be like a regular resolver, a DNS over HTTPS resolver, and so on. I may be having like a blocking DNS resolver, and so on. So the English language has this wonderful word called kludge, and you can see that so this system is getting too complex and too brittle. And so whenever systems, are no longer manageable, that's always a good time to, think about alternatives. And so my point here for the discussion is that, well, there is actually an opportunity to make these tussles more manageable by, so in this example, disentangling these functions, so traffic steering, control, and analytics, which may, each of those may be somehow useful. So traffic steering, for example, we have seen that in the keynote, is getting really more and more important considering the growth of live content distribution over the internet. And just the the basic feature of in ICN, so secure access to named data, independent of location, that can be a massive simplification. Not talking about caching at all, just traffic steering alone. Also, maybe have a look at the CDN papers earlier today. Secondly, most networks will need some form of control point. So my company, my home, my country, perhaps. And you could say that maybe the ICN trust model can simplify that, totally independent from traffic steering, right? The traffic steering can leverage ICN name-based routing but other inputs as well. So you know quite well which names are trustable, acceptable. This could be, filtering could be implemented, say, in a relatively straightforward way. That could be good or bad, right? So control censorship could become more explicit, easier to implement. Sometimes that's desirable, sometimes maybe not, but at least it's kind of independent from this traffic steering function. And analytics, we also talked a bit about during the CDN discussion. That could be done in the application layer, maybe with a bit more transparent to the user. And so it doesn't have to involve the network so much. And of course, that's also something where ICN maybe wants to do some more work, so name privacy or user privacy in general. So my message here is that so this could be actually an opportunity to tear these things apart and maybe arrive at a much more manageable design for these functions.
Well, thanks, Dirk. Very interesting stuff. So as I mentioned before, our next speaker is Emanuele, who's coming from an economics angle on this. So Emanuele, could you try sharing your screen? Hopefully that's straightforward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gareth. Thanks for the invitation, and apologies. I'm sort of a little bit of an alien because I come from I'm an economist, but I found the theme of this panel extremely interesting, and so I just more than a real presentation. What I did was I tried to form in my mind what relevant questions could a different internet architecture based on ICN, pose. And of course, these are very partial questions in the sense that it's due to the interaction with my own research interest. So the key issue, I'm not going to repeat it. This comes from your material, from your slides. As I understand them, it's about the feature of ICN, and this is I got it from your material. So let's save time and I'll jump straight onto the questions. As an economist who has been working on economics of networks, the first issue that comes to my mind is in relation to competition policy. So whenever we as economists try to look at markets, we try to understand that the first step is necessarily to look at to measure the relevance of players. This is very easy in traditional markets. You see how much they sell and you see what is the market share they have, and this is always extremely complex within the internet. One of the ways that we in our research we suggested to work on was to try to explore and probe the existing networks, and then to look at measures of centrality of the network of specific AS nodes within the existing network. So to use, for example, trace routing or any other possible ways to do the probing, to work out the network that was coming out from exploring it, and then to analyze what was the real market power, if you want, based on the centrality in terms of essential facility, of unavoidability of given nodes. So this is already, of course, we all know it has many limitations, many parts of the net cannot be explored and so on and so forth, but it's sort of a, there was an approach that somehow we use in our research. And one of the key questions that came to my mind was how would we be able to reconstruct a network, a set of links forming the SS network and measure centralities in a system with an ICN architecture. So is it a kind of a qualitative change from this point of view? Would we still be able to understand how to reconstruct centralities and market power of the single players? So this is really just even a precondition, even to assess the players' market size, and then to address possible issues of dominance that we know from other proxies that are enormously important for all the platform markets. Moving to a second possible question that came to my mind was, but of course the first one is absolutely essential, not to try to understand, is it still possible to try to quantify the role of different players? Then once you have assessed something about the size of the players, then another issue that comes in terms of competition policy, which is the main issue, one of the main issues when economists think about network industries, is this new architecture, does it play any role in facilitating the emergence of horizontal agreements? So one of the issues is that could we have some sort of could this facilitate cooperation from platforms in order to restrain competition? So just I tried to check. I was looking for a different set of images, and then I didn't find it, but I found that Peaky Blinders, which is kind of a series dramas in the UK based on gangsterism at the beginning of the 20th centuries, seem to be available through two different platforms, which are probably competing platforms, both Netflix and BBC iPlayers. When I then, so I want to say whether the same content was available through competing platforms, and then I did find in order to look for the images, that somehow on iPlayers now was not available while it was available on Peaky Blinders. So I was just wondering, would that be a way, clearly there could be benefit for two competing platforms to alternate each other's about the possibility of broadcasting the same contents. So is the logic of what I understand of ICN of being able to to identify the elements of the net based on names, on unique names, but of course names and reflect contents, could this facilitate some sort of agreements or implicit coordination of this kind of thing, whereby players and platforms could be finding easier to find ways of monopolizing the market by sharing it, either across geographic areas or across timings? I'll show it this week, you saw it next week, but we will be the only one. There will be no competition. Jumping to the third possible question, this was actually the first programmer that I was looking for, that I knew was across two platforms, and I came across It was Anthony Bourdain, Parts Unknown. And again, this is shown on both Netflix and Amazon Prime. Now, why again these things? Now, I wanted to focus on externalities, because on cross-platform externalities, one of the key elements of competitions among platforms is the fact that they link sellers of contents to users. And a key element in providing competitive advantages of a platform is the existing customer base. And that makes it very difficult for an entrant to dislodge an incumbent. So it makes the whole system less competitive, less functional, less innovative, and more problematic. So my question will be, how will a name-based architecture interact with these externalities? And how will this affect market entry for new platforms? So, for example, is it going to be easier to find the same product across different platforms or not, if there is, for consumers, so are the switching and search cost higher when we have a different architecture. And this could just, if it reduces the switching cost and the search cost, this could mitigate the existing cross-platform externalities and make the life of an intern more possible and more, and easier. So there would be economic benefits. Otherwise, there would be the opposite effect. And then to close, just on a more positive note, there is one of the key issues. This is part of a different heart of working with the ITU study group, one ITUD, and one of the key issues, of course, in terms of network expansions in deprived areas or in developing countries is the problem of infrastructure investment in infrastructures. And one of the key issues is always about how to facilitate forms of infrastructure sharing in order to spread the cost to reach areas which are less profitable. And again, there are also the hypothesis of IXPs and things are the examples of cooperative infrastructure sharing. So I'm wondering, how would it be in relation to the issues of caching and proliferation of contents in different things? How would the new ICN architecture make it easier, the possibility of sharing not only cables but also contents, and reduce the cost of investment and network expansions in less profitable areas? These were the key questions that prompt to my mind from what I see about what the discussion was about. Hopefully they are not too outlandish in this setting, and thanks for the invitation.
Wonderful, thanks, Emanuele. So Eve, have you managed to get the microphone up and running? So incidentally, just whilst Eve shares her screen, one thing Cedric mentioned on the Slack channel was that AS centrality might not be the best way to look at these things, because the CDN or the caching infrastructure might undermine the underlying topology, because obviously the content's placed in different locations. So Emanuele, that's maybe something to think about for the Q&A sessions afterwards. And over to Eve for her 5-minute pitch.
Okay, and I'll try to keep it to 5 minutes. Let's see, thank you for inviting me here. I've really enjoyed listening to the other panelists. What I could hear, unfortunately, I was having technical difficulties for part of that, but here I am. I was really impressed with Bruce Magg's, what I would call Econ tips and takeaways. And so I thought I would start with that, because this is what I extracted. Again, I was hoping he'd be on the call. He's not here today. But these really resonated with me about questions we could ask ourselves as a community. How do these pertain to us? What he said was, make your customer dependent on you. So how do you become indispensable? Given that the internet is no longer a place of benign community where people come together, how do we protect the infrastructure from attack? I loved his slide about the system has to look good, because economically speaking, you are showcasing technologies, which is essentially plumbing, to those who need to see a sleek user or command central interface. The system, and this seemed quite apparent, at the same time, the system has to run itself, big question. But to reflect here on something he said, that the value proposition has to be reflected in the flow of payments. And tucked away in there were 3 commandments that I extracted. One was know thy value propositions. So of course for CDNs, it was all about low latency, and they came up with their secret sauce to deliver that through active measurements and through daily recalibrations in order to put their edge servers in the right place. But they were very articulate about who are the stakeholders and partners. So he talked about getting the data from data providers, content providers, but also partnering with ISPs and co-location providers, and also know thy traffic. There was this big shift at some point in time where streaming data became the prevalent kind of data on the network, and that's still the case today. I was also completely intrigued with his assessment about needing to sell high margin services. Each of them potentially quite separate, very incremental, very hard to implement, and unfortunately sometimes very uninteresting in and of themselves. But one important takeaway was that the incentives and the costs must align. So how do these translate to ICN? Those are things that I think we need to ponder as a community. For me, again, the kinds of things that I want to share right here, like to seed some thought about, the evolution of ICN in terms of its deployment strategy, and where and why has ICN gained traction in certain places. I think we need to go back to its original intent, which was, we're talking about the global internet at a moment in time where deployment of new technology as a community was not something that was easy to do, particularly if the ISPs, we had just transitioned from networks being owned by the NSFs of the world and the ARPAs of the world, at least in the United States, and suddenly the ISPs, how do we make it worth their time? But over time, I think an important shift happened, which was to discover that ICN is pretty well suited for the IoT context, where if you're living at the leaves of the network, you can control your own domain. And so, I liked the idea of the centrality of the market, because you don't have to adhere to others' policies so much as build your own government at the edge of the network. And if you're the administrative controller, then you can get to deploy whatever kind of routing technology you want. But naturally, with the overflow or the torrent of data that's coming at us from IoT things at the edge of the network, that naturally led us to the edge. And so I think what has been going on underneath is that the infrastructure of the internet and the control points in it have really shifted, and the notion of using ICN for all kinds of data also really exploded, if you will, moving away from using ICN as just a sensor-based measurement in IoT context to the rich exploration of video, AR, VR, autonomous vehicles, all kinds of use cases. And even more recently, those of us finally coming to the table to join our friend Christian Chudin about whether or not we want to ensure that we can also send around data that's just bits of data that is functionality. And so the marriage of ICN for routing, caching, and compute is top of mind now. I would like to mention that I think that this next phase of edge computing is that all these edges are going to proliferate, and that's going to disrupt once again who holds the power to dictate what kinds of technology gets deployed. And I think we're going to have a proliferation of edges, which means we're going to have a proliferation of edge service providers. They may not be the same as our cloud service providers. And we're going to have more of our data, knowing thy data, getting back to that commandment, is we're going to have more data coming from wireless and mobile devices. This is the year where the tipping point is we have more mobile and wireless devices than we do static devices. So that's going to upend things a bit. Let me see how I'm doing on time. I need to wrap up here, but I wanted us to look at not so much the deployment success, because we know that these are just prototypes, but to ask where else might we find similar conditions where the prototyping can be successful. And so I would wager that we need to look for places where control can be retained and trust boundaries are clear. And similar conditions might exist in places where we can federate our edges logically, or in proprietary infrastructures like Akamai's and so forth, but also to get back to this point of, under what conditions is data stewardship truly needed? With the unruly data, we need to be able to discover, search, and perform compute across data that's going to be scattered, if you will, around the internet. And the notion of, do we need to extend our DNS in order to find all of this stuff? I was also very intrigued by Bruce's reference to real-time requirements. And now with the industrial edge, we have even harder real-time requirements. Are these places where we can leverage the goodness of ICN's, bidirectionality of paths and pinning of paths to deliver harder real-time requirements. And then I want to have a shout out to those of you on the call who I know many years ago, almost 20 years ago at this point, put forth the idea of knowledge claims. I think that some of the places where ICN might be considered imperative to our customers are places where there are use cases where we need to be compliant to regulatory issues, whether that's GDPR or whether it will be the coming requirements regarding carbon footprints and carbon neutrality. So I think applying it to those kinds of places might allow us some success as well. I'm just going to flash these up here, but just to repeat, these are Bruce Maggs, and these are for you to ponder and raise. How might ICN provide a service that's indispensable? What are the value propositions of ICN? And is the value proposition or the value propositions sufficient given our stakeholders? Who are our stakeholders, particularly with an architecture that's evolving? And of course, the tussle between ICN and the diminishing transparency due to things like TLS and HTTPS, and what are the full benefits and costs, and are they balanced? So I will leave it at that.
Cool, thanks, Eve. Okay, so let's move on to our fourth speaker, Ignacio Castro, who hopefully is on the call and can share screen.
He's indeed on the call and he's about to share his screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes. So over to Ignacio for his 5-minute pitch.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Eve, Emanuele, and Dirk for those great presentations. So I'm also going to be talking a bit about economics because that's my background. So I typically look at the economics of the internet, and in particular, I look at the economics of the interconnection of networks. How do the different stakeholders interconnect in order to be able to move the bits around? I also look at the economics of internet governance, and I wanted to reflect from these perspectives, how does this affect to ICN? I think everybody knows that money makes the world move around. Some people won elections just by saying that. And David Clark acknowledged that one of the fundamental problems that we had in the internet was that we learned how to move bits, how to route them, but we never learned how to route the money that pays for it. And I think this is particularly relevant when we look at the past examples. So the fact that we were running out of IPv4 was a fact for a very, very long period of time. And the fact that we need to move into something else was also very clear. However, even though we were running out of IPv4, IPv6 didn't manage to catch up, slowly managed to catch up. Even though the benefits were very clear, more than the benefits, the real need to do it was very clear. We were extremely slow in doing it, despite of tons of ITF meetings and a lot of promotion about it. And I was thinking about it, what's the reason? And I think one of the fundamental reasons is, again, economics. What is the cost? What is the benefit? And who actually gets this benefit? And there is this paper that look at the standards and they look at the likelihood of the adoption. And it does not reveal a fundamental truth that we were not aware of. But I think it makes it quite clear that even though the idea might be great, it's not necessarily trivial that it gets adopted. And one of the fundamental things that they realize is that, well, if it's not backwards compatible and it's unbounded, so basically the whole internet needs to accept it, and you cannot directly benefit from it, well, the likelihood that it will be adopted is quite small. And this is the case for IPv6, but probably for many other solutions that have been proposed through all the years that the ATF has been running. And coming back again to ICN, I think that one of the fundamental questions, certainly not the only one, but sorry about that. What are the benefits? What are the incentives for the players? And why would a transit provider give up their business model and embrace? Why would a CDN change their business model and move to ICN? Why would what would be the benefit for AAA access? why would network operators decide to give up on all the knowledge they have and embrace a different knowledge? And I think that there are partial answers for some of these questions, but I think it's quite difficult to find what's the definitive answer. And I think that in order to move forward, having answers to these questions would be more than a good thing, would be necessary. And since we have already listened to the pitches of everybody, I think that it would be great if we could just move to a debate. So back over to you, Gareth.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ignacio, and thanks to all the other speakers for the 5-minute pitches. So before we kick off into some of the questions, I'd just be keen to hear if any of the panelists want to comment on the topics that have been raised so far.
Yeah, sure. So maybe on the points that Emanuele and also Ignacio just raised. So, you know, what does it take for adoption, and also what is the potential? So Emanuele mentioned the potential synergy, you know, of several CDNs that could maybe join forces or make it much cheaper and so on, sharing infrastructure. So I think one of the problems in ICN research and also this whole adoption discussion in the past has always been this way too ambitious perspective. You know, I mean, ICN came out of the future internet funded research, where the idea was, okay, now we have to really work on a completely new network. And I think that led to many mistakes and also problems in, you know, getting it actually deployed. I think what's actually more promising is really to look at, so what are, you know, pressing problems, or what are exciting new things that you cannot easily do, or it's just too expensive or too complicated with today's technology. And if you find that, you don't have to change the whole network. You can, you know, deploy it gradually at the end. It's much more realistic, and probably also, yeah, solves much more interesting problems. And so that's what I maybe wanted to throw in at the beginning.
Emanuele, Ignacio, is there anything you want to?
Just, if I may just add one extra question to this very interesting question from Dirk. So you say, and this is, I don't know whether probably I don't fully understand the also technical aspects, but between, I understand, is it possible to have an incremental type of adoptions of an alternate system? Because I think that probably I might get mixed up now from Ignacio's presentation or from Eve. There was the issue of having the necessity to, if we change, it has to change, you know, there should be a critical mass of changing it within the system, like the switch from IPv4 and to IPv6 is, you know, there's a problem of kind of a critical mass. Is it possible to have incremental peripheral edge changes of this architecture without having to change the entire system? Because that, of course, would allow to focus on investment, for example, whereby the cost issues, where there is less profitability for the single operator. So there is a need of finding cooperative ways of extending the network.
So if I was to answer that, I would say that's the only way that works. So basically, don't even ask the operators or something. Just, you know, build applications and make them work, and you will find way to, you know, use ICN natively as in overlays if needed. So that, and from that you can grow the network. But what's really difficult is basically anticipating a whole sea change in the content distribution industry just because there might be ICN in the future, you know. So all the you know, the issues, or that we also mentioned in the CDN discussion earlier, so that there is well, there are measures against piracy and all these things. So all these concerns will also hold in the future. So this makes me skeptical as to whether CDNs would share much infrastructure in the future. So you might still change the economics in a bit because there may be, say, a more efficient network. So maybe you actually require less, say, content copies like repos or application layer caches at the edges. But there might still be CDN operators. So that's why it's difficult for me to predict how the CDN synergies will look in the future. So just to your particular point.
So this might be a great point to chip in with one of the general questions I was curious about, because I think it touches upon many of these points, which is what do the panelists think are the key inter-stakeholder tussles that may emerge when deploying these types of ICN technologies? And when I say the word stakeholder, I mean quite broadly, covering things like network operators, CDNs, standardization bodies, governments, regulators, and so forth. Eve, I don't know if you want to kick off with your thoughts on that matter.
Well, I think that so the stakeholders, actually, why don't you come back to me?
Ignacio, I don't know if you want to in here.
Yeah, so let me answer by going back to the previous question of Dirk first, which I think it really hit the nail. Like, I completely agree that the clean slate approach is a very unlikely thing to happen. It hasn't happened yet, and it's for a very good reason. It's just very difficult. So what is the incremental approach that could be feasible? What would be the killer app where ICN would bring this competitive gain that would allow for it to be deployed? And this is in a way saying, what would be the situation in which the tussle between the different stakeholders would not be that great, that actually allows for this to happen? And to answer your question, I don't really have the answer. I don't really know what could be that key space. I have the feeling that.
Maybe I'll jump in here. Maybe I'll jump in because I think that kind of back to this point about what's happening to the underlying architecture and our model for how we get our services. We get them through service providers that have these kind of walled off, siloed infrastructures, if you will. And a lot of what ICN does well is to carry that data. And so if the world is moving away from a single service provider world and it's being partitioned into sort of edge service providers that likely will need to peer with each other because there are many more things that are moving around in the network, then maybe the tussle is between how do I get my data out of these cloud service provider resource infrastructures into edge service provider infrastructures, and how do I cut across them to get access? I sort of look at ICN as, its secret sauce is its namespace, and the namespace serves as a way to take all of these different administrative domains or service providers or clouds of different sizes and gluing them back together, given that we're trending towards the proliferation of all these siloed gardens. And so I'm thinking that maybe, the tussle will be between all these different providers, whether they're CDN providers or cloud service providers or telco providers, but then ICN may be acting as the vehicle by which we have a holistic namespace or access to it anyway. And maybe that's its secret sauce, and nobody's doing that yet. So this kind of goes back to the comment that Dirk made earlier about, is there something new that could be a killer app? I don't know if it's a killer app, but it's certainly a function that doesn't exist as yet to glue these administrative domains or provide separate silos of providers back together. But again, the question might be, do you believe that that's where the network and the network architecture is headed?
Emanuele?
Just a quick observation again. Thank you to all the previous ones. If there isn't, if there are individual incentives to make this step yet, or the killer app, or whatever. We could maybe learn something from also the telecom regulation, the mobile telephone regulation. So where there is a mandatedness, regulatory authorities might mandate the access to a given infrastructure if it is considered like, and so that competition could take place on small parts. So I was just wondering whether something similar could be thought as a kind of a mandating interconnections on these issues, even when if the economic individual incentives are not there yet. I know there are international issues because the regulation is usually at national level, so this is something much more complicated level of international coordination thing. But like in terms of addressing, because it's a sort of, I can see a sort of a market failure when you say there's not yet a killer app where there is but the fact that technically it's possible to start from the edges, and what Dirk was saying, I think could provide a rationale for start thinking about how can we try to mandate integration and sharing infrastructure in order then to provide enough critical mass so that things could kickstart.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I think one good example perhaps for this discussion is for example Etsy mobile edge computing, which was a technology mostly driven by network operators and say incumbent vendors, that with the hope that you could provide edge computing capabilities that application service providers would like to use, and then the operators could monetize their network better, and also maybe offer measurement data and the platforms and so on. And so as far as I know, this hasn't really taken off in the real world. What has happened instead is that, say, all the hyperscalers and the big OTT service providers, well, they are basically going to the ISPs and like Netflix, for example, and they are offering them their Netflix OCA boxes, so the caches, and the ISP is just providing rack space and yeah, some routing and traffic steering to those boxes. And they do that because it's in their own interest, because it helps them to save peering and transit costs, and because they can yeah, serve the requests locally. And so this is how technology, I mean, is conceived and maybe planned, but on the other hand, how different approach actually gets deployed. And so what I'm seeing in this space when I look at, say, ISP networks today is, so of course there's not only Netflix, there is well, the Akamai, there is Amazon Prime and all the other services, Google, and so they're all doing like similar things, and there is really complexity for ISPs to provide all the for example, user mapping to caches, the maybe user IDs or MAC addresses and so on. And so of course you could say, well, in ICN-based system, this could be much nicer, simpler. And so if you can figure out how to provide well, the mainstream services, maybe with a slightly different traffic steering approach at the edge, that could be interesting. It's just not trivial, and the question is, well, is the effort basically worth the cost saving that you can achieve? But so I think it's really, we really have to be kind of accepting the fact how the whole network and content and distribution industry has basically changed from what has been like the anticipation by telcos and vendors like 5 years ago.
So I mean,
yeah,
just
sorry.
No, please go on.
I was going to say that I completely agree. The fact that people like Netflix has come up with a solution that actually works pretty well. It's true, but it at the same time comes with a relatively large cost, and is the fact that before you come to a region, you have to deploy servers almost everywhere. You have to go to the large ISPs, put a big server. You have to speak with the local eyeball networks and put servers there. Otherwise, the quality of service that you provide might not be good enough. So even though a solution exists, that doesn't mean that the solution is cheap. I would agree, though, that the incentives are very well aligned. So everybody has a gain, both the able networks, unless they can have some sort of monopoly power. They do see a reduction in their transit fees. But yeah, this all comes at a cost. They also have to pay the electricity bill of the servers. And if they have their own content, like for example, I know Telefonica was not quite happy about the idea of having servers of Netflix because they have their own content, and they are at the same time a tier 1. So why in the world would you allow to a competitor to put a box of their own inside of your network? So even though the solution is there, it's not perfect and it's not cheap.
I mean, this is a good point to make because in many ways, a shift to ICN also shifts the definitions of the stakeholders that we've been previously talking about. We've talked a lot about economics. I'd be curious to hear the panel's opinions on regulatory matters. So does the panel think that the introduction of ICN might introduce some new regulatory challenges? And does the panel think that there are any regulations that might be actually helpful to the deployment of ICN?
I think that's a really good point. And actually, it was speaking also my interest. I'm by far not an expert on regulation, but maybe there is some other people here that has a better understanding on the topic. As far as I know, GDPR to a great extent is a matter of what are the physical boundaries in which data should be contained. And ICM basically says, like, let's forget about location, it's just about the content. So I'm wondering, would GDPR be viable with ICN? Would we need to rethink regulation? Or maybe there are solutions that can be provided on top of ICN in order to comply with this regulation?
I actually have wondered whether or not the naming mechanisms could help us understand the boundaries, certainly across countries, but in general, that the namespace might help us to understand, you know, when data has transgressed, and that those policies might be reflected there. It's not commonly done now, but it might actually help us. At least in the arena of tracking data as it crosses boundaries that it shouldn't, country boundaries.
Dirk or Emanuele, do you have any thoughts on?
Just very quickly, no, I think that the regulation issue of regulation is very, very important. It's a very hot and debated one in international fora because there's this constant tension between OTTs and network providers in the sense that there's a strong asymmetry of regulatory legacy. The network providers have been heavily regulated historically, and OTTs have been historically completely unregulated also because they have the ability of, you know, materializing here and there and everywhere, but also to be able to escape, even if in terms of fiscality, if you want, the ability of being pinpointed to a given legislatory or regulatory regime. So I think this is really like an essential point. It's very good questions, and I think that the main issue is that the boundaries are being blurred. And having asymmetric regulations is something which is probably slowing the development because it would leave some players completely unleashed and so others super controlled. So without taking any of the sides, the whole idea is that if the move towards this different architecture could also allow to find a way of harmonizing regulations, because at the end of the day, the different. I think every player is also switching roles. Like many OTTs are also constructing their transport networks and competing on that. And then, as Ignacio was saying, many providers and carriers develop their contents, local contents, which could be maybe in local languages. I believe that the content from Telefonica might be, maybe unique because they're probably not, because they're probably developing Spanish and so on and so forth. So I think this is a critical issues, and the most important thing is to try to harmonize and not to create, asymmetries in how different players are regulated based on the functions. The asymmetries could be based on the market power, of the centrality, of the consistency, not based on the function of the play in the system.
So I'm hoping that ICN does not need regulation to succeed. That would be very sad. But regarding the other question, so what changes might be needed. So I don't think that this whole GDPR discussion really applies to ICN. I mean, just the fact that you are dealing with named data objects, that doesn't basically qualify.
It's not exclusive to ICN.
What's that?
Right. It's not exclusive to ICN.
Yeah, right. And so all the GDPR regulations, for example, I mean, they really apply at the, say, storage and application layer. And in that sense, to me, I would treat ICN as a what's called transport. So basically, yeah, it's packet networking with few more features. And so it shouldn't require regulation just from that perspective. There may be other things, of course, but so that's often something that is brought up, and I don't agree to that.
Very, very quickly, sorry, Dirk. I agree with you, and there are things on the chat. I can't follow too well the chats and the debate, unfortunately, in the multitasking. But when I mention regulation, it could be regulation to protect the development of new entrants. So it's not necessary that ICN needs to be regulated, but if they are the entrants, they might need some regulation that protects them from already established players. So I'm not saying we need to regulate ICN in a sense, fix the tariffs and the price and the floors that they have to be, pass it through. But like it could be like in order to protect and to protect the development of a new and entrant technology, if you want.
Mm.
Yeah, sounds very very sensible actually. So I'm painfully aware that we're nearly at the end of the hour. So to wrap up, I just wanted to ask each one of the panelists if they could provide just one sentence of advice to the technologists on the conference as how they could better design systems to reflect some of the regulatory policy and economics issues being discussed. What would that one sentence be? Don't make me point at people. I'm going to point at Ignacio and Emanuele first, actually, because they're coming from the economics background, so they might have some experience of the barriers that have been faced when deploying prior network technologies.
I guess that my takeaway would be to not forget the economics, though of course I'm biased, basically making sure that the incentives of the different stakeholders are aligned. That could be my takeaway.
Yes, I agree with Ignacio. Of course, we need to consider that there is always competition. So we always like to speak about stakeholders, but there are also, again, when there was a citation of David Clark, we don't know how to rule the money, and there is competition amongst them. So while it's necessary to have aligned incentives, there needs to be, they need to know how many players can the system really sustain, and that would change completely their economics conditions and the profitability. So understanding the market and the market consistency, the market size, I think is essential.
Yeah, again, that sounds very sensible.
I'm happy to go. What I was thinking was I was thinking of the song Come Together. You know, there was a reference to the Money Makes the World Go Round song. Well, this is the Come Together Right Now song, because I think we not only need to articulate the stakeholders, but then the value proposition for those stakeholders. That would be my message.
Okay, so my message is that really don't focus on the traditional, say, telco environment, but really try to do something useful for applications. And it's fine if that's over the top, as people still say. That was the whole idea of the internet, right? So permissionless innovation starts something at the edge. And so ICN has many benefits already from a say application development simplification perspective. And so if you can leverage those and then like grow from the edge, that's totally fine. And IoT is a very good example, but also you know, multimedia, edge computing, these kinds of applications. I think that's actually promising. And then basically we can take it from there.
Again, sounds very, very good advice. So actually that brings us to the end of the hour. Thank you very much for the 4 panelists. All the contributions been super interesting. Thank you for people listening. You may have noticed that there's been a lively discussion on the Slack channel as well. So I think if the panelists have a little bit of time extra, you can dive into there and maybe respond and kick off some further discussions. That'd be great as well. Anyway, that's the end of the session, and I'll hand back over to Ken.